patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much for joining me in this solo episode, episode 189. This is the final solo episode of 2025, if you can believe it. That's why we've got the fireplace crackles in the background, just to give a feeling of a fireside chat with you all. If you are new to this podcast, welcome aboard. Firstly, a big thank you and shout out to our dedicated Patreon supporters. Their contributions are helping to keep this show going, and their generosity is absolutely incredible, and they're enjoying bonuses with their listenership experience. So if you're enjoying our content or like additional benefits, check out our Patreon page down in the show notes below. If you haven't already, hit or smash that subscribe button or sign up for our email list at our website, georgewashingtoninstitute.org. We are continuing our Sacred Honor series discussing the signers of the Declaration of Independence in the order in which they were signed or proved, to the best of my ability, of course. And we are moving on to a new signer and a new colony. Now, if you've been listening the last few episodes for the Sacred Honor series, we were on Delaware, and at the time, I thought I was going to be covering the next signer from Delaware, Thomas McKean. Well, it turns out that Thomas McKean signed the Declaration very, 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 very late. In fact, he is the final signer of the series because he was the last signer of the Declaration of Independence. So if you're excited about Thomas McKean, don't worry, he will come up a lot later, but we are going to be moving on to the colony of Maryland, and we are discussing our next signer, Samuel Chase. Now, Samuel Chase does have a couple names. There's another Samuel Chase who appears later in the 1800s, but we're talking about the first prominent Samuel Chase in American history. Samuel Chase was born in 1741, and he had a very classical education, and his expertise was in law. So he entered the law profession and was very, very active. The way I'll describe Samuel Chase is he was all over the place in a lot of ways. He was not one of those founders whom you might imagine who was very committed to some sense of decorum and of just rigor. I guess you could say a bit like a George Washington or perhaps a James Madison of some kind. This person was not. Now, Samuel Chase was very, very controversial in a number of ways. Although the controversies I'll explain in a bit, I think it's a bit more nuanced. It's not really controversy necessarily in terms of his views, because there were a number of people at the time who share the political views of Samuel Chase. Rather, it was a combination of his background, but also maybe his style too, and the way he interacted with some contemporaries. In any case, he is one of the young lawyers up and going in the 1760s. This, of course, is the time when we have a lot of activism within the colonies about the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and other very, very unpopular acts, the Townshend Acts as well. And he is very active in his home colony of Maryland. He's from Somerset County in that state, or what would be the state of Maryland. He was very, very active with the grassroots. So he actually co-founded the county chapter of the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were really, really active and were just kind of, you imagine some of the biggest disruptors at the time for the Patriot cause, and he did so by developing a very close friendship with one of the other signers, which we'll be covering in this series. In fact, they're from the same delegation, and that's William Paca. So the two are very close. I'm sure I'll mention Samuel Chase when we get to Paca's episode, but they both were very much at the forefront of leading these causes in Maryland. And he ran in Anne Arundel County, I believe, for Samuel Chase. He ran as for the representative for the House of Delegates in 1766, and he served in the state/provincial legislature for quite some time. And he was one to, again, be a bit brash in his style, and I'm going to try and describe here what I mean by that. He was one to, I guess you could say, rub shoulders the wrong way with some people. For example, when he was part of the demonstration with the Sons of Liberty, this is a quote from some of the prominent political elites back at the time. One time he was quoted as a, quote, restless incendiary, a ringleader of mobs, a foul-mouthed and inflaming son of discord, unquote. That's pretty strong language for one of the founders of the American cause, because when we think of some of these signers, I would say that at this point we've seen a combination of activism, but also some sense of stoic contributions, how we say, or style for a lot of these signers. It usually has been a combination of both, because it's not fair to just say that the founders were all just completely civil in everything they did, and they treated everybody really nice. Some of them were really were quite disruptive in their tactics, but generally speaking, unless you were maybe a Samuel Adams, you were kind of in that realm of some mixture. From these descriptions here of Mr. Chase, this seems like he was very, very, very vocal, and someone who maybe was not the best in terms of working with different factions. Remember, some of these founders, some of these signers, tried to work with the British to try to make a deal, to try to get to a better place. I don't think Samuel Chase was really part of that group. In fact, here, according to a quote here from says from interpreter Anthony Stewart. I'm not sure where this is coming from. This is, by the way, from the state of Maryland. This is a Maryland.gov site. Finding this information. And he says, quote, this ringleader of mobs attempted to prevent the burning of the tea ship Peggy Stewart, which is interesting because you would think that he would go so far as to go burning ships and whatnot. A really interesting character, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly what kind of a signer he was, but from the get-go you can see that it's at least Samuel Chase might be trying to figure out where he was in this cause. I would say that would be the same for all the signers at this point. When you get into a cause, you don't know exactly where the boundaries are necessarily on and how much you promote your activism, how much you promote your cause. And just a couple other facts here in terms of his service, because these signers did serve these very important roles, not necessarily as formal legislators, because of course this is all happening just right off the bat in terms of what institutions had to be put together. In 1774, Chase served for the first Maryland Convention Committee of Correspondence, Council of Safety, 1775, Maryland Constitutional Convention, 1776. He was also a part of the Annapolis Convention, which was a big deal in terms of debating the role of Maryland in this whole process of independence, or of advocating for independence. My reading is that he didn't really like the rules of the convention. I can't imagine that he just sat through and just followed all the rules. I'm sure there were a lot of norms and rules broken for someone like him, but in any case, this is part of that description of how Samuel Chase may not be the typical founder or signer that we might imagine. Chase had a bit of a tough time with money, and this is not uncommon when people are involved in politics. Some of the things he was involved in, like I mentioned, he was a lawyer, so that was, I guess you could say, his main profession. But he was also dealing with a number of risk-taking initiatives. He tried a number of ways to get into entrepreneurship. So, for example, he was part of a group that operates some salt works in the late 1770s. And he was part of the law firm. Then he also was involved in purchasing wheat and flour in 1778. And this is at the time when Congress was trying to deal with some shortages of materials. And so there were some people who accused Chase of using his knowledge as a congressman, as part of the political elite, shall we say, to benefit himself. What he said here, according to the state of Maryland site here, is saying that he said that the shortage was common knowledge, but apparently the voters really didn't think so. What was common knowledge was the fact that people did not like his explanation, and he actually lost his seat when he ran again. But this goes again to show that with the founders and signers, we have to always come back to the idea that these people also had these personal interests, right? These interests in politics, and so, a lot of times they really did not. They're not the saints that we might worship them to be as, because we often like to in history only find the positives for certain people depending on where we stand in history. But it's really important that we understand that the signers, what they did was very, very important. Right? And it's that combination of personal interests and the interests of the common good that really brings the signers together in so many ways. Because you can point to any signer, just like with any group of people, and you can always find that there's going to be people who are going to do things for their own interests, for their own benefits. That is just natural. And so when we look at the signers, we do need to see them as the human beings they are, knowing that people like Samuel Chase did things that were not very savory. But that is just part of human nature. Otherwise, what would be the purpose of James Madison saying that if men weren't angels, there would be no government? Well, what would be the purpose of really the Constitution? In fact, I would say that it's the experience that the signers had amongst themselves that probably shaped the way they looked at the Constitution. And credit to the Anti-Federalists who came around and did not support the Constitution because they thought it didn't go far enough, which led to the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. So this is, again, part of what I want to get to you all about the signers is to, again, move away from just the blanket view of the signers as they all only did the right thing, but moving to the sense like, no, they were human beings and they produced a fantastic start to our country. That is what we should be doing in terms of our approach to understanding these key American political figures. Chase was not done trying to find ways to make money, and I imagine that with the ups and downs of that time period, financial stability was definitely not a virtue that was very attainable for everybody. I'm sure Mr. Chase feels that or felt that way at the time. In 1782, it says here, it purchased a confiscated Nottingham Iron Works company, and he was also part of some element of confiscatory legislation. And then he also was involved in some other ventures. There's one that involved navigation of the Potomac River. I'm not sure what the details of that company were, but apparently it was not successful. Message here, it says here, Baltimore Wharf, lumber yard, and then it says, quote here, the mud and pile driving machine. Unquote. I don't know what that is really describing here. And sounds like some sort of construction company, but it's probably isn't. The point is, Chase was involved in a lot of different initiatives and really struggled to find that traction to sustain himself and sustain his family. He did find some other responsibilities. I mean, he was a big part of the legal profession, and it actually helped him a lot because later on in his life, he became an associate justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, nominated by none other than George Washington. Clearly, George Washington was able to see past some of the things he did or did not do, and gave him the nomination for associate justice. He did also serve in a role after the American Revolution and helped negotiate return of Maryland stock in the Bank of England. And that's actually where he met his second wife, Hannah Kitty Giles. And he would have 2 daughters on that. So there were some positives as part of his journey, part of his service as a signer. There is a very critical episode, and we would get more into this episode in a separate solo program. But Samuel Chase is also caught up in, as I mentioned, a number of controversies, but a very, very notable one occurred in 1804, and that is because Samuel Chase was involved in some very, very partisan fireworks here. In fact, when he was nominated, of course, he was nominated technically not on he was a Federalist. However, George Washington was not a member of either party. So he was nominated by a president who didn't have an affiliation technically with either side. However, he was a Federalist, served in the Supreme Court for several years until President Thomas Jefferson takes power. And Jefferson, to put it shortly, tried his best to purge the Supreme Court and try to fill it with justices who agreed with his policies or who at least did not dislike him. And there was a whole case. We won't get too much into the details here, but Chase is caught in this controversy because he was accused of being very partisan in his way in his mannerisms, in his role as an associate justice of the Supreme Court. And on March 12, 1804, the House of Representatives voted 73 to 32 to impeach Samuel Chase. He was acquitted, though, by the Senate later around that time, but he is actually the only Supreme Court justice to ever have been impeached. I think what it shows is that when we think about partisanship in America, we have to really look back and find those episodes where partisanship in that conversation was truly, truly a huge issue, and it overtook our institutions, perhaps to the point where our institutions are almost lost that early as part of our American history. And I just can't imagine what it was like at the time for someone like Chase, who already has dealt with quite a bit. Now, I'm sure part of it is on his end, part of it is just the circumstances of which he was surrounded by. But the thing that really makes me just wonder about that time period is how do these signers and these founders, particularly well after American Revolution, how did they see these debates on partisanship and all that relative to the American Revolution? Of course, there's plenty of writings and all that, but it'd be really interesting to find some sort of systematic way to code all these different writings and letters, try to find a way to see if there's a pattern on how these signers and founders debated the issue of partisanship, particularly when political parties were relatively new. What does that mean for political parties later on? We often think that partisanship is, or at least the current partisanship is relatively strong and certainly has really negative consequences on our civics. But there's always a different side to it, and there's always a different era in American history where people really did care about partisanship, and they abused it too. We are not the only we are not the only ones who have made mistakes on partisanship. Now, I'd like to just wrap up a little bit more about Mr. Chase here. He does continue to serve in his role as Associate Justice. He does not finish that term, of course, in terms of he never retired from the Supreme Court. He dies on June 19th, 1811, at the age of 70, which is very, very old. And I'm surprised that he was able to serve that long, given, again, what had transpired for all those years. But nonetheless, he served for quite some time for our Supreme Court. Now, I like to get a bit into our 3 takeaways for our episode. There's quite a lot to take in here for Samuel Chase. The first is the desire for power really takes a toll on people's behavior. I say that because Samuel Chase was trying to get into a lot of these different entrepreneurial projects, different roles. And it's because when there's competition for power, it's always going to be fierce. We often think that when people aspire to get into political office, that there is a path. We always say, well, what was the path for someone to take? I think it's a bit misleading, though, because a path kind of indicates that there was some sort of paved or natural method of getting somewhere, when in fact it is fraught with all these different battles and arguments and debates and backstabbing. I mean, just all these different things that can happen, and we need to maybe take a step back and realize that this fight for power, which defines politics, can really affect how people behave. And I just suggest that as perhaps a possibility for why Samuel Chase maybe did not get along with everybody. Recall that with some of the signers we've covered, there were some who did maintain some relationship with people who were loyal to the crown. Now, that was very, very fraught most of the time, but for the years up until right around 1776, we still had signers who tried to make efforts to, again, make amends and try to get some sort of compromise, some kind of deal. But the desire for power, I think, really can shape the way we see the political landscape. And so it's really important for, I think, anyone who wants to get into some kind of capacity in politics to ensure you surround yourself with people whom you can trust to, in some ways, hold you accountable. I mean, like telling you when maybe a decision is a good decision, or maybe when you might need to think twice about making such decision. I've actually told people about just the fact that I have these interests in getting in running for office in the future. I don't know what that timeline looks like. However, what I do know is if I surround myself with good people, if we continue to surround ourselves with people who can encourage us, people who can give us candid advice, I think we can maybe curb some of those desires and perhaps at the very minimum keep us a bit more grounded to reality, because politics can very much warp our reality and how we see people and how we see things, just because power is the common currency within that world. The second takeaway I like to give is we need to really describe politics as an exercise of investment and risk of someone and of someone's time and energy. And it's not just a gimme. It's not just one where, you get to choose what you like to become and only reap the benefits. I talk a lot about this in our solo episodes to some degree, in that politics is complicated. It's not easy. We need to cut through this simplistic mindset that we get a lot in politics when everyone tries to make things simple because psychologically it's a lot easier to process. But when we get to that point, when we can describe and discuss politics as something where we are making investments, we are taking a risk, I believe it elevates the mission of politics to some degree if you're doing it for the right reasons. I remember just talking with people when I was doing these internships in DC and asking them about their careers, and a common theme that you really find is there were people who just were not sure what was going to happen if they were to go down this path of public service. I saw that firsthand in the Bush School, where you have people who were already on these careers. I know there's this one classmate of mine. He was working for Wall Street before he decided to go to the Bush School, to go to public service. From what I recall, he said that all he knew was he didn't know what public service or politics was really going to be like if he were to get into it. What he did know was that what he was doing in the private sector wasn't working. It wasn't working for him. He didn't feel the drive to continue, and that's why he made a change. And he decided to get his master's and to go into a career of public service. I just think it was very interesting to see that politics really is very much risk-taking. You don't know what it's going to look like. You don't know what roles you're going to fill. Just a bit similar to Samuel Chase. He was trying all these different means of gaining income and all that. I will say that perhaps one of the reasons why he was very much criticized and just depicted as a crazy person is because there is an element of elitism at the time, and really throughout American history, where he is not coming from a very prominent background in the same sense maybe as other political elites. And when you have certain groups of people who are already, I guess you say, for lack of a better term, part of a club, part of some sort of group, when you have an outsider come in to try and disrupt and try to make him or herself a big name, well, could be other members are trying to put that person down. And very, very common in politics when people feel like there's an outsider coming into their group. As part of the tribalism in human nature, people are driven to try and put down people, those who are trying to, or what they appear to be taking someone's position in politics. All this to say, the investment, the risk, and all that, it's something that we maybe should discuss a bit more when we think about a candidate, we think about an election, knowing that whenever someone runs for Congress, or runs for office, runs for president, runs for treasurer, runs for the, I guess you say maybe the secretary of state for a certain state in the union, there's always a risk and a sacrifice that needs to be made, whether it be through time, through money. Just having that appreciation might be a start to recognizing the value of public service in this country. The third takeaway, it is a pretty big one, a very common one, but I really want to reiterate this point. It's not about what you know in politics, it's who you know. I say this a lot to my class when I teach about politics. One of the things I've done is I've brought guest speakers to share a bit about their experiences and how they see politics or media or policy. And the point is to show people that there are these individuals who got to where they were not purely on what they did or their talents, but because they knew the right people and they connected with the right networks who got them to where they are. It's not a fair game all the time, right? Just because you know someone does not mean a meritocracy. But there are just certain realities that we need to recognize in American politics, which is that there are people who've gotten to where they were. They could be completely incompetent. They could maybe not know at all what it is that they're doing, but they got there because the circumstances just aligned, the stars aligned for that person. So that's something to consider, both as a stepping stone, but also maybe thinking in terms of our institutions. Should we be allowing this extent of people just getting into office simply because they knew people? It's probably going to be a combination of people running on their own merits and also people running on their own connections. I don't think we can or should aim for a politics that is unrealistic and that only goes via merit, only goes via connections, because you can clearly see the risks, and you can see how if you're only running on merit, that might take away from the idea that politics is about knowing people, about making connections. If we're only submitting resumes to be qualified for office, then what is the point of running for office? On the other end, if we're only running on politics just only because people know one another, it leaves a lot of people out, and it leaves out the people who are not as well connected. It leaves out the sense of meritocracy. So it really is this combination of maybe politics should be about what we know and who we know, as part of the takeaway. But for now, there is a very big term here about who you know. Perhaps that's something to change, maybe as we're thinking about the future of our institutions and the way we think about the way we interact with others in our civic environment. And with that, thank you all so much for listening to this episode about Samuel Chase. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure, once again, to check out our Patreon page, subscribe to our show. Have a great rest of your holiday season. We got actually a bit of a surprise coming up later this month. Have a great rest of your day, rest of your week. Remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.